Hello. Today we are talking about your response essay assignment to clarify some points about what that requires, and then to connect it into the idea of the rhetorical triangle, which will be foundational to everything you do in this class, in your written assignments, and really throughout your life, in other college settings, in professional life, and in your personal life. But we'll start with the immediate practical demand that you have for this first essay. The response essay requires that you read one of the selected texts, choose one that seems especially interesting or relevant to your life, something that connects in some way to your experience, and then explain that using examples both from the text and from your life. In order for this to work, we really need to consider the response essay as an argument. And rather than argument as something negative and contentious, we want to see argument simply as a claim, a statement. And what you're going to be doing with the response essay is saying, here's this text that I have read. Let me tell you a little about it, some summary, some discussion, a little bit of evaluation, and then connect that into your own life. How is your experience related in some way to the text that you have read? That relationship can cover lots of different facets. There could be similarities. Maybe you read a text by an author whose life experience is like yours, and someone that you can relate to in that way. Maybe it is a topic that is touched on in the text that is meaningful to you, that again has been influential in your life. It could also be a difference. Maybe you read a text that is very different from your experience, that you can't see yourself in, that you can't understand necessarily from direct experience, and the response essay is to explain why that is. What is the place that you are coming from? How does that differ from the place the author of the text is coming from? Ultimately, however, what you're trying to do is convince your audience that this is a valid way of reading the text, that there's something significant about this. The response essay should help us understand both the text itself through your experience and your experience through the text. Both will be more meaningful through the essay that you write. So it's not persuasive in a traditional debate style essay. You're not trying to win someone over to a particular side, but you want your audience to consider what you have to say as being worth listening to. In order to understand this, we'll discuss the idea of the rhetorical triangle. This is not a modern invention. It's not a newfangled idea. This goes back to ancient Greece. This is the sort of thing that Aristotle talks about in his Poetics. And a lot of our understanding of the rhetorical triangle is rooted in that ancient Greek philosophy and lifestyle, to be honest. Much of what we understand from the rhetorical triangle comes from an oral context. People would present speeches or recite epic poems, and that's very much the context from which this derives. Aristotle's basic argument is that any time we communicate, giving a speech, in writing, whatever the means winds up being, there are three main components to that communication. There's the person who is presenting the message, what we call the creator or the author. So the speaker, the writer, whoever is presenting that information. There is the modality of the communication, the actual text itself, as well as the context for that communication. And then there's the recipient, the listener, the reader, what we call the audience. And those three terms, author, text, and audience, are pretty common in discussing rhetoric and understanding how writing works. But regardless of what the communication is, whether it's something very formal and lengthy, or something very short and casual, the same basic idea applies. Someone is creating the message, someone is receiving the message, and the message itself is mediating that communication. We typically envision this with a triangle where we put each of those at a different point. So here we have the author at the bottom left, the text at the top in the middle, and the audience at the bottom on the right. And there are a couple of interesting things about using a triangle for this. because it would be easy to present this in a linear fashion. The author, say, on the left, the audience on the right, the text in the middle, because that is how that communication does in fact play out. But the triangle allows us to see different relationships. There's a line segment connecting the author and the text, and another connecting the text and the audience, and finally a third between the author and the audience. And what those represent are different facets of the communication act. The author creates the text. That's the writing process. That's what you are doing in this class. The audience receives the text. This is the reading. This is the analysis. That component of decoding the message from the text is really reading on the right side of the triangle. And then at the bottom we have this very interesting relationship, which in my mind goes both ways. In creating the text, the author is thinking about the audience. What does this audience need? What are their expectations? Is the audience going to be resistant to the information the author is providing? The author has an audience in mind and tries to tailor the message to meet that audience's needs. And at the same time, in decoding the text, in the process of reading and analyzing, the audience has certain expectations and value judgments about the author. We make determinations about the person creating a message based on the message that we receive. And that communication, that relationship is one of those fascinating parts of this. So this should make sense. I think this is a relatively straightforward idea. We're now going to complicate it a little bit by using some Greek terms. You may be familiar with these from previous writing classes or even philosophy or history discussions. But the ancient Greeks conceived of three main components to an argument. The Greek terms are ethos, logos, and pathos. And you can see I've overlaid those on our triangle corresponding to those same points. So at the bottom left, where the author was, we have this idea of ethos. At the top, where the text was, we have logos. At the bottom right, where the audience was, we have pathos. These ideas roughly translate to credibility or authority for ethos, language or the word for logos, and emotion or sense for pathos. And I've overlaid those with the 3 points of the rhetorical triangle to highlight the fact that the author is very much interested in establishing and maintaining his or her credibility, that sense of authority. Note the word author in authority there. The text itself is the word, the communication act between the audience and the author. And this idea of logos, I think, is very powerful in an LDS context in the New Testament. In John chapter 1, when John explains that in the beginning was the Word, the original Greek in which the New Testament was written uses the word logos to mean the Word. And there's something in there about the power of the Word that I think resonates with our understanding of the gospel. And then down at the bottom right, where we have the audience, we have this emotional sensibility. Because really the audience is making an emotional judgment, having an emotional response to the message of the text. So this is typically how the rhetorical triangle is presented, and we make that correspondence between these Greek concepts, which are really means of persuasion. We can convince someone through our own authority, we can convince someone through the logic of an argument, we can convince someone through an emotional appeal, or better yet, a combination of two, or perhaps even all three of those. However, I'm going to complicate this a little bit more now, because to me the most important parts of the rhetorical triangle are not the points, but really the line segments, the connections between things. So our new version of the rhetorical triangle takes author, text, and audience and creates in the connections between them these modes of argumentation, ethos, logos, and pathos. So what we have here is the author, in creating the text, is drawing on his or her credibility. That sense of authority is represented in how we use research, in the kinds of language that we employ. The construction of the text, that process of writing, is very much rooted in authority. And at the same time, the text creates our authority. The more we have written, the more we have published, the more we have pursued an idea, the more weight we carry. The idea of logos then is transposed to the right side of the triangle as the communication between the text and the audience. This idea of reading is very much rooted in the logic of understanding the text. And so logos is that reading, that interpretation, that analysis. This leaves then the emotional connection as that between the author and the audience. And again, as the author conceives of his or her audience in the process of writing, and as the audience judges the author based on the text, that's really happening at an emotional level. Throughout the semester then, I want you to think about how you are both an audience. As you read the text for the response essay, you are playing that role, decoding that text and trying to understand thereby that author. And then at various times in the semester, you are very much the author, writing an essay to one of the various audiences that we will assign throughout the semester. And so in each of those acts, as reader and as writer, you need to think about these connections, these relationships, these modes of persuasion. Here's the application of that. In the response essay, there are two main ways you will use the rhetorical triangle. And it's useful at this point to note that you won't necessarily mention these ideas overtly. To say in an essay, I will now employ pathos is, I believe, rather counterproductive. These are things that are happening below the surface, behind the scenes, more subtly than that. But here are the two applications relative to your response essay for this idea of the rhetorical triangle. First, in reading, you need to think very carefully and very critically about the text. Why did the author create it the way that he or she did? Why did the author make certain choices? What was the author conceiving about the audience itself? You are very much in that bottom right role, decoding the text and thinking about the author through that text. Secondly, you then become the author of your own essay, and you need to think about your audience. The response essay asks you to write to fellow BYU Idaho students, people who are interested in these kinds of ideas, thinking about some of these issues, and like you in some ways, yet also very diverse and representative of many different backgrounds and experiences and ways of reading the very text that you have here. And so you need to think very cautiously and very deliberately about how you present that information and how you construct your text. Next time we will talk a little bit more specifically about the idea of drafting and how creating the essay, moving from the plans to the actual first draft, employs these ideas and is in fact a rhetorical act.